Good morning, and welcome to the Family Access Conference called Handling Alienation Using Better Communication and Self-Care. So I'm Bill Bernet. I'm a child psychiatrist and a forensic psychiatrist in Nashville, Tennessee. And my topic this morning is a little bit long, but the name of the topic is New Research Helps Us Understand How Alienated Children Think and Behave. And I have several goals for this presentation. And so let me give you a little bit heads up as to what I plan to do. First of all, this is intended to be educational. That is, I'm going to tell you about some research projects. Maybe you've heard about them, maybe you haven't. So I hope that this is educational in the general sense of that term. And I have to admit, some of it is a little bit technical. So I don't want to make it too complicated, but in order to explain some of this research, it is, at least some pieces might be a little bit technical. Well, I don't want this research just to stand all by itself. And I want to be able to explain the implications for understanding and relating to alienated children, and perhaps also to the alienating parent. In other words, I'm going to try to apply this research to how you can relate to your children and your grandchildren, and to try to help you understand what do we know about what's underneath. What are the underlying forces that push the phenomenon that we call parental alienation? And my third goal for this presentation is I want to invite you, parents and grandparents, to participate in some of these projects. Now, some of them are already over and done, but some of them are ongoing. And so take a listen. And if you're interested, you might be able to participate in one or two of these projects. So first of all, let's give a couple of definitions. I always like to do this at the beginning of one of these talks, just to make sure that we're always on the same page. So this is one part I want us to read together, the basic definition. Parental alienation refers to a situation when a child, usually one whose parents are engaged in a high conflict separation or divorce, allies strongly with one parent, the favored parent, and rejects a relationship with the other parent, the alienated parent, without a good reason. So some people like to see these diagrams, as you can see in the next slide. And in this diagram, you can see how the alienating parent and the alienated parent are in conflict with each other. And they each blame the other person for what's going on with the child. When we use the term parental alienation, we're talking about the little yellow squiggle. The little yellow squiggle is in the mind. We're talking about the mental state of the child and the child's relationship with the rejected parent. So that's what we mean by the term parental alienation. And the big red arrow, the term for that is what we mean when we say alienating behaviors. Some people use these terms in a slightly different way, but I think this is a good way to use them to be consistent so that we're all on the same page. In other words, basically, the alienating parent participates in alienating behaviors that cause the child to be alienated from the rejected parent. So one of the things I think we need to keep in mind are the levels of severity of parental alienation, because sometimes that's really important when you think about what to do, what the intervention should be, or how to understand what's going on. So let's run through these levels of severity. First of all, mild. Mild is easy to understand. Mild means that the child says, I don't want to go see the parent, say daddy, I don't want to go see daddy, but the child goes and is fine. In other words, the rejection is transitory and brief, and once the child is with that parent, everything seems to be fine or almost fine. Moderate parental alienation means the child says, I don't want to go see daddy, and the child goes and is difficult most of the time. In moderate cases, there might be moments when the child is getting along with the rejected parent, but for most of the time, the child is negative and says, I don't want to be here. In severe parental alienation, the child says, I don't want to go see daddy, for instance. And the child persistently and adamantly refuses contact. And of course, that might go on for months or even years. Now, there may be situations when the child actually does go see that parent, but is negative or oppositional during the entire visit. For instance, during the entire visit, the child might stay in her room. The child might bring her own food so that she doesn't have to eat with that parent. The child might spend the entire day on the phone with the alienating parent. So those are some things in terms of definitions to keep in mind. So let me start out by a research project that I instituted a year or so ago that had to do with children's artwork. Some of this I presented at another meeting a few months ago, so some of you might have seen this. I'm not going to repeat the whole thing. I'm just going to show you some highlights of children's artwork and the research on that, and to talk about what might that mean for parents and grandparents. So this first picture illustrates severe alienation, and this picture was drawn by a 9-year-old girl. And as you can see, this is a very grim and unhappy drawing that the little girl did of herself. She says, I hate me, I hate my life, and so on. This is an extremely disturbing picture. I mean, normal children would never draw a picture of themselves like this, but this picture illustrates how deep and how disturbing this condition is. The next one is also a self-portrait illustrating severe alienation by a 19-year-old girl, and it's also very unhappy. This is actually a very nicely drawn picture. This girl really has some talent with regard to art, but you can see that it's a very disturbing, a very unhappy self-portrait, and you can see how the girl has a certain amount of insight into her own condition. This next one is another case of severe alienation, and it's by a different 17-year-old girl. And these pictures actually were used in a show, a high school art show, and the alienated parents were able to see the pictures and get copies of them, which is how we have them. So in this one, you can see the girl with the long dark hair, and I'm going to show you closer up what a detail here, because I don't think you can see it in the overall picture. But if we go to the next slide, it's a close-up of the girl's face, and specifically a close-up of her eyes. And you can see that in tiny letters in her eyes, she's saying, help me. You can kind of think about, what does that mean? What is she trying to communicate? She's certainly saying something about how desperate she feels. These are all pictures of children who were alienated from one or the other parent. And they were all provided to us by the alienated parent who had access to them. So that's why we're able to discuss them with you today. This next one is part of a series. There are two of them. The first one is prior to the child becoming alienated. And it's a very nice picture. And the child is saying, this 8-year-old girl is saying, I love you, Mom. But a little while later, she's actually age 11 now. It's the very same girl who drew these notes. And these are very disturbing notes. And you can see what they say. Go away. No one has loved you, and so on. So obviously the girl has switched from being very positive and very sweet and having a good relationship with the mother to having this very, very negative and unpleasant relationship. So that's kind of like a before and after. Here's another before and after. In this next picture, there's a note that was written by a 9-year-old girl to her dad. And she's saying, you can read it together with me, Dear Dad, you're the only person in the world to be my daddy. and so on. And it says, drum roll, that is you, love from this girl. So that's a very sweet picture, very sweet note of a girl, a very positive note to her dad. And not long after that, there was a very disturbing picture. And I need to warn you a little bit that this picture is very unpleasant and negative. And as you can see, it's the very same girl who was very sweet is now saying, unsincerely me. And she says, you, head unattached. So she's having this fantasy, an extremely dangerous and murderous fantasy about her dad. So that, this illustrates how a child can go from being normal to a few months or maybe a year or so later being extremely negative. And that's why we think, this is a mental condition. It's a mental disorder or a mental condition in the child that needs to be identified and treated. Here, I have one more series of pictures, and this is also before and after. So prior to alienation, this 7-year-old girl draws this kind of neat picture of her family, and she writes on it, I love my mom and dad and my whole family. And then she also, the next one, draws a picture for her dad, where she says to daddy from so-and-so, I love you. Well, a while after this, things go badly and the girl becomes alienated, and she writes the following. She writes this little story in her this diary that she's been keeping. And let's read this together. She writes it, and then the actual story says, this story is called He and She and the Kids. She had the kids. She gave the kids to him. The kids didn't want to go. He gave the kids back. She had the kids. She gave the kids to he. They did. The next day, he took the kids. He got shot by a tank. The kids lived happily ever after with she. So, this is kind of like a murderous fantasy, a death fantasy that this little girl has about her dad. And in the fantasy, the child is getting shot by the tank. And in the next slide is the actual picture where it says Army people. And then it has a picture of a Army personnel carrier vehicle of some kind and a tank that's firing a gun. And then in the last one, you can see a little bit of a close-up of the tank that's firing the gun. So this is a type of research in which we have collected these drawings. And I'm using this to illustrate something that I think is important, which is called from bench to bedside, which is illustrated in this next picture. So, and this is the kind of thing where a person, a doctor or a researcher of some kind does some research and tries to apply it to the clinical situation. And this happens all the time in medicine, that certain kinds of research is done, and we try to apply it to actually taking care of a patient who has some sort of condition. And in this little drawing, it's clear that on the one side is the microscope, the mouse, and, these are components of research. And then on the other side are medical personnel who are taking care of somebody. So that's what I'm going to try today with these illustrations. I'm going to try to apply the research to what you all might be experiencing here. Here's one more picture that pertains to bench to bedside, which is a very elaborate, it's kind of a beautiful drawing with all these little chemical notations on one side, and then the person is reaching out with their hand to take care of somebody with the other side. So how can I apply this idea, bench to bedside? How can I apply this to children's artwork? Well, what does it show us? What can we learn from it? So first of all, it shows us that parental alienation is real. There are people who say there's no such thing as parental alienation. And I think that these drawings illustrate in a very concrete way the mental state or the mental condition of these children, that this is a real mental condition. And it helps us see that children who experience this condition have highly distorted thoughts and feelings. And it helps us see that children who experience this condition have a mental condition. So how can this pertain to parents and grandparents? Well, first of all, think about it. You know, maybe your own children and grandchildren will draw pictures. And this artwork is a window into their thoughts and feelings. There's nothing new about this. I mean, therapists who see children and psychologists and psychiatrists and social workers for many, many years have used drawings to help communicate with children, because a lot of times children are not very good about saying things verbally, and you can use artwork to communicate back and forth with the child. So in this case, you can kind of have a window into what they're thinking. And actually, if you want an activity, if the child is still seeing you off and on, do drawing together. And if you do it, don't just make it an assignment. Do it where the child does a drawing and you do a drawing. You kind of compare them. Some people do this where you sequentially work on the same drawing. In other words, you have a piece of paper and some coloring, pencils or crayons or paint even. And one person starts the drawing, and then the other person does some, and then they go back and forth and take turns until the drawing is completed. If you ever do this, save them, of course. Create a little bit of a collection of these drawings, and don't just save them randomly, but keep track of them. In other words, what you do, you know, back of the drawing, you put the child's name and maybe your name, whoever did the drawing, and the date, and save them. And that might be really interesting. It might be really useful at some future point to have these. So this is an ongoing research project. We started this a year or so ago, and we've been collecting, I guess we have about 40 examples or from 40 different families. So we might be able to write this up. We might be able to do an article about this at some point, or perhaps a book chapter. And so if you have drawings by your children, you can contact me. Here's my email address, william.bernet@vumc.org. And I'd be happy to discuss with you what we might be able to do with the artwork. Incidentally, we kind of want it in stages. It'd be great to have artwork done by the child when they're, I guess you would say, normal, before the alienation starts. And then while the alienation is in process, and then later, hopefully, if it resolves, later. So that's a research project that's ongoing. I want to tell you about another research project, which is a little bit grim, which is called the Lethality Research Project. And once again, I need to give you a little bit of a warning that I'm going to talk about something which I realize is unpleasant, but it's a reality that we have to think about. So what I'm trying to explain is that occasionally parental alienation is not just dangerous, but it's lethal. And there are examples that in some of these cases, somebody in the family commits suicide. And sometimes, occasionally, that has been the child, not the child, but sometimes a teenager, sadly and tragically might commit suicide. Or sometimes, more frequently, it's actually the parent. It's the targeted parent who's become so desperate and so frustrated that he or she has no way out and might commit suicide. So in other cases, it's a tragedy that takes a different form in the case of murder. And occasionally the targeted parent was killed by the child, either the child all by himself or the child in connection with the preferred parent killed the targeted parent together. Or even more tragically, sometimes the alienating parent, in order to exactly ultimate revenge kills the child. That's happened a few times. So yeah, I'm going to give you a few examples. And some of these are well known. Incidentally, all these examples are on the public record. All these examples are either somebody wrote a book about it, or it's been in newspaper articles over and over again, or journal articles. So let me just go down this list just to kind of give you a sense that this is a real thing. There's this boy named Dash who lived in Vancouver, Canada, who, when he was 16, he killed himself. That was a very sad story, and his mother wrote a book about it. There was a man named Richard Ostrow who was the father, and his child, his son, who was 10 years old, killed him. The son killed the father. There's another boy named Eric McCall, who was a little boy, and in this case, it was the mother, the alienated mother, killed the child and herself. And once again, in this case, the dad wrote a book about what happened. And finally, there was a woman named Carrie Baker, and she was an alienated mother, and she was murdered by the alienating father. Now, I'm not sure why, but 3 of these examples come from Texas, which I think is just an accident. I don't think there's any particular reason for that. But that's a coincidence about these examples. Let me give you one more example, which is an interesting historical example. In the process of doing this research project, we came across an article that was published in the American Journal of Psychiatry, a very important psychiatric journal, way back in 1977. And the name of the article was Mother-Son Folie à Deux, a case of attempted parricide. So in this situation, the child tried to kill the father, but did not succeed. And what's interesting about this, if you read the actual article, it clearly is a situation of severe parental alienation, which happened about 10 years before parental alienation was ever written about or ever identified in the medical literature. So here's some things from that article about folie à deux. And you might know folie à deux means madness of 2 people. So this is the kind of thing where one person has a delusion and that person shares the delusion and imposes it on a second person. So this is a quotation from that historical article. Ms. A began to tell Bobby that his father wanted to kill them, that Mr. A had put razor blades in their beds, cut her hair, and poisoned their pets. So these are some of the delusions that the mother had, and she told the son these ideas. Slowly, Bobby began to feel his mother was right, and they began to plot to murder Mr. A. They decided to burn down his home while he slept. The mother and the boy lived in California, and I think the dad lived in Virginia. Bobby flew alone across the country to his father's hometown and set his father's house ablaze that night. They were supposed to be asleep. The boy set the house on fire and started to, left the house and was going down the street. Fortunately, the father woke up, got out. Nobody was hurt in this. But we know about this story because subsequently, the mother was hospitalized in a psychiatric hospital because she had these delusions, and the boy was hospitalized, of course, in a different program. And it was possible to sort out exactly what had happened, and that it was what we would call a shared psychotic disorder. But what was fascinating is that this is in a psychiatric journal years before parental alienation was ever named or identified. So what can you get out of this sad, and these are tragic stories? Is there some lesson here for parents and grandparents? First of all, we're really sorry. If this happened to your family, some kind of extreme violence, we're sorry and we offer condolences. But it is fascinating that sometimes when this has happened, that the parents essentially become heroic by sharing their family stories. And those four examples that I gave you, two of them were written by parents, one by a mother about the son who killed himself, and the other by a father about the son who was murdered. And I guess the lesson here is that these tragedies help to prove the reality of this horrible condition. I mean, it's hard to say, but there are people who say that there is no such thing as parental alienation, that it's a myth, that it's a hoax. And these tragic cases help to prove that it is, in a tragic sense, these things are really happening. So how can parents and grandparents get involved? So this is also another research project that we're working on. We're trying to collect examples. So far, we have only been collecting examples that are already available to the public, but we're going to reach out and ask for examples that are only really known to the families, or information that might be considered personal or confidential. And I realize that this is horribly sad, but if you all want to participate, if you have such a, or you know about such a situation, you can send them to me. So this next topic of research that I want to talk about is how to tell the difference between alienation and estrangement. So basically, of course, let's make sure we all agree on what is the difference between alienation and estrangement. So alienation, of course, is a situation where the child rejects a parent without a good reason. And the child's rejection is far out of proportion to anything the rejected parent has done. And the cause of the alienation is usually the acts of the alienating or preferred parent. Estrangement, of course, is when the child rejects a parent for a good reason, such as a history of abuse or neglect. And the cause of the estrangement are the acts of the rejected parent. So it's really important, both clinically and for legal purposes, to be able to tell the difference. You know, if a person is conducting an evaluation, to be able to tell the difference in a methodical, systematic manner between alienation and estrangement. And sometimes parental alienation theory is criticized by individuals who say there isn't any way to tell the difference. And that's really, really wrong. We think there are ways to distinguish alienation from estrangement. And I'm going to give you some ways that have been demonstrated through systematic research. In other words, these are not just hunches, but this is research that can be applied to clinical situations. So first of all, this is an article by a woman named Gina Rowlands, and this is a test that she developed, the Rowlands Parental Alienation Scale, that is a questionnaire that's given to parents, and the parents fill out the behaviors of their child, and this can be used to help in the evaluation of family situations such as alienation. And in the next slide, I list the factors that are considered. These are the factors that Dr. Rowlands put in her scale and that she administered to almost 600 parents. And there are 6 factors: the campaign of denigration, the independent thinker phenomenon, reflexive support of the favored parent, presence of borrowed scenarios, spread of animosity to the extended family, and lack of positive affect toward the rejected parent. I mean, most of you will recognize that these are almost the same as the 8 signs of parental alienation that were originally listed by Richard Gardner in 1985. So Dr. Rowlands has studied this extensively and found that these actually work, that you can actually give these questions to parents, and based on their responses, the children can be classified as alienated or not. And here, this next slide is her conclusion. I'm going to read this. Parents who reported either a court evaluation or court findings had confirmed the presence of parental alienation. These parents scored significantly higher on all six of the factors, as well as the overall score. Anyway, I was explaining the Rowland's test, which is a little questionnaire that's administered to parents. And so it's whether parental alienation is present from the point of view of parents. So this next one is some research done by Amy Baker, and this is from the perspective of the child. And this is called Differentiating Alienated from Not Alienated Children, a pilot study. So in this case, Dr. Baker developed the BAQ, the Baker Alienation Questionnaire, and it was administered to children, some of whom were alienated and some of whom were children of divorced families, of divorced parents who were not alienated. And it consisted of 28 questions, which are given to the child. In other words, Dr. Baker was attempting to identify parental alienation by collecting information from the child, not from the parents. And in this next slide was her results. And as you can see, in some cases, the child was engaged in reunification therapy. And of those, 18 of them scored alienated on the BAQ. And the children who were children of divorced parents, but not alienated, most of them scored not alienated on the BAQ. And if you add all this up, you would see that this test was 87.5% correct in distinguishing alienated from non-alienated children. So what does this have to do with you all, with parents and grandparents? Well, first of all, I think it's reassuring when these arguments occur, it's reassuring to know that there are objective differences between alienation and estrangement. Now, these two tests that I mentioned, there are others, but these are two that are particularly interesting. One for parents, one for children, are not used all by themselves. Nobody would ever give this test all by itself as a way to diagnose parental alienation, but they would use as part of a larger evaluation. And I think it's useful for parents and grandparents to know that if there's a methodical evaluator, you can use these tests to help distinguish alienation from estrangement. So there's a particular aspect of this that I was involved in, and it's the next topic, which is splitting. And I want to go into some research which has to do with splitting. Splitting is when the child says one parent is all good, perfect, all good, and the other parent is all bad. That's what we mean by splitting. So this is one aspect of telling alienation from estrangement. But to do this, I have to give a little bit of background information, and that I'm using as a basis for this the 5-factor model for the identification of parental alienation. This has been published over the last few years, and let's run down the 5 factors. First, the child manifests contact refusal. Second, there was a prior positive relationship between the child and the parent who is now rejected. Third, there's an absence of abuse, neglect, or highly deficient parenting on the part of the rejected parent. Fourth, the alienating or the favored parent has manifested alienating behaviors, and you have to be able to identify these. And fifth are the signs of the behavioral signs of alienation in the child. So let's take a closer look at factor 5, the criteria for factor 5. Now, these are the same 8 things that Richard Gardner talked about way back in 1985. The campaign of denigration, frivolous rationalizations, the lack of ambivalence, and so on. Well, of these 8 things, one of them, and in the next slide, you'll see what I'm talking about. One of them, lack of ambivalence, is particularly easy to measure and identify. You know, one of the problems in doing this research is ideally the criteria that we have, the symptoms or the signs that we list, can be not just identified, but can actually be measured. So here, that's what I want to explain about lack of ambivalence or splitting. So first of all, I want to explain how this can be identified just in an everyday evaluation. So you really see what I mean by splitting. So this next slide, the heading says likes and dislikes. So what I would do with a child is I take two pieces of paper, and with the child, together with the child, I write at the top of one of them mom and her name, and at the top of the other one, I write dad and his name. And I put likes and dislikes. Or sometimes I explain dislikes means things that you wish were different. And I ask the child to fill in, and I do the writing. In other words, the child dictates to me. And I write down what the child says about likes and dislikes about each parent. So here's an example of a child who is basically normal from an intact family. And you can see that in this case, the likes and dislikes balance each other for both parents. For instance, with the mom, the child likes that she loves me, she tucks me in, she buys me toys. Dislikes, she has headaches, she spanks me. And dad likes, he loves me, he watches me play soccer, and so on. He dislikes when he gets mad. So these are all pretty realistic. There's a balance between likes and dislikes, which is normal for children to have some things that are nice and some things that are not so nice about their parents. And it's balance between what he says about the mom and about the dad. So in contrast, I want to show you what a child said who was alienated. And this is an actual case from a number of years ago of a 10-year-old boy whose mother was the alienating parent and the dad was the target. So this is what the boy said about mom. Almost everything are likes. She's talented, strong, nice, loving, polite, easygoing, easy to convince, mostly calm, and so on. His criticism of mom was she should stop smoking. She smokes once a week, and she shouldn't smoke in front of me. What he says about dad, there's only a little bit that he likes. Maybe we had fun a few times. He buys me shoes and toys and so on. So things that he dislikes, this is how he started. He gives me stuff and wants me to go with him. He child abused me, held me over a railing on the 5th floor. He was drunk, and so on. But this continued. In other words, that's just the beginning. On the next slide is the child's continuation of his dislikes for dad. He pinched me in the privates with kitchen tongs. He hit me. He spanked me for no reason. And it goes on and on. I'm not going to read all this. He hit mom. He cusses her all the time. He said secrets about mom that were not true. Some of this, I like this one. He forced me to eat shrimp. Some of this happened long ago when he was an infant. Mom told me how he got drunk all the time and so on. So in this case, I mean, this is just a clinical example. This isn't research. This is just a clinical example of how you can elicit from the child, a good evaluator can elicit from the child lack of ambivalence. And this is one way to do it, by making this list of likes and dislikes. Well, my colleagues and I thought that it should be possible to do this in a systematic, quantitative manner that can be measured statistically. And we published 2 papers. And the name of one paper was An Objective Measure of Splitting in Parental Alienation. And then the name of the test, the Parental Acceptance Rejection Questionnaire. And then the second paper was Measuring the Difference between Parental Alienation and Parental Estrangement, the Park Gap. And in the next slide, this is an example of what we would call quantitative research. In other words, qualitative research is research that's descriptive, and there's hundreds and hundreds of papers published that describe parental alienation qualitatively or descriptively. There are many, but not as many papers that constitute quantitative research. And this is an example because we are able to measure the splitting in a mathematical manner. So we use this test, this questionnaire called the Parental Acceptance Rejection Questionnaire. And I'm just, here are a couple of examples of some of the questions. There are questions about my father, and some of them are positive. Some of them are negative, like my father does not really love me, for instance. And then the child indicates whether it's true or sometimes true or not true or so on. And there are a series of questions. There are 60 questions about mom and 60 questions about dad. And in the next slide, you can see a little summary of our results. And in other words, in a normal child, and a child in an intact family on the left-hand side of the slide, you can see that the score for the mom and the score for the dad are positive. The lower the number, the more positive it is. And they're almost exactly the same. Even in a divorced family, the score for the mom and the score for the dad is almost exactly the same. But on the right-hand side of this slide, there's for alienated father and alienated mother, the children who had an alienated father, the father had an extremely negative score, and the mother had an extremely positive score. And the reverse, if it's an alienated mother, the father had an extremely positive score, and the mother had an extremely negative score. So these extreme scores constitute splitting. In other words, the children view one parent as good and the other parent as bad, totally bad and totally good. So this is abnormal. Normal children never do this. So as you can see, when one score is very, very high and the other one's very, very low, that constitutes what we want to call a gap. And so we created this measure called the Park Gap, which is in the next slide. And the Park Gap is on the right-hand side of the slide in red. And these are numbers that represent the difference between the one parent and the other parent. But as you can see, these numbers are very, very high. These are abnormally high distinctions between the mom and the dad. And on the left-hand side are the children who are not alienated, do not have this gap. And they totally segregate except for one child, which produced that this little questionnaire was 99% accurate in distinguishing alienated from non-alienated children. So that's really interesting research on this particular issue. Let me tell you one more research that essentially replicated what we did, but it was done in England. It was done with obviously a different population of children and a different test. So the name of this article is called Exploring Parent-Child Relationships in Alienated versus Neglected Emotionally Abused Children using this other test called the Bernet-Anthony Family Relations Test. And this is kind of a clever thing that in this test, the child has in front of the child are a series of little cardboard mailboxes. And each mailbox has a person's name: mom, dad, my sister, sometimes other people like my grandmother. And then the evaluator pulls up a card and it has something, a statement like, this person is nice. And the child puts that little card in one of the mailboxes. So the cards are positive and negative. Some of them are neutral. And then the child gives that attribute to one of the people in the family. And the next slide is the results. It has some statistics on it. I'm not going to try to go through this exactly. But in this little test, the preferred parent, meaning the favored parent or the alienated parent, had extremely positive messages. On the other hand, the targeted parent or rejected parent had extremely negative messages. And this was to a very high degree of statistical reliability. So this is another test. In other words, it's in my research, I used the PARC. In this research, we use this thing called the family relations test. And both of them distinguish alienated from non-alienated children to a very high degree of reliability. So what's the message here for parents and grandparents? Well, once again, I think it's reassuring to be able to know that you can make this distinction. That a good evaluation can tell the difference, because we're critics of alienation theory say that we have no way to do that. We have no way to tell the difference. But I think this is what you should think about with regard to your child. When they engage in this process in front of you, they might engage in splitting. They might say, you know, parent A, my other parent is wonderful all the time, and you are nasty and horrible. That when they do this, they're not being willful, they're not being oppositional, they're not even thinking about what they're saying. That they're simply going down this mindset that has been created in their mind, which is an abnormal mental abnormality, in which one parent is totally good and the other one is totally bad. And this is a defense mechanism. Defense mechanisms are unconscious. People don't adopt defense mechanisms knowingly. They unconsciously adopt a defense mechanism to make themselves feel better. And if the child is caught in the middle of a severe loyalty conflict between the two parents, the child feels very bad, and the child can get out of that situation by gravitating to one side. It's an unconscious mental defense mechanism. So the message to you is don't try to argue them out of it. I want to take this one step further and talk about splitting and how it might show up in a brain scan. And the reason why we're doing this, showing you this, is to illustrate that this is not just a mental mechanism. This is probably a phenomenon in the brain where the brain circuits are changing to make the child behave in this kind of, in this abnormal way. So this is some research that has only been published recently by a graduate student whose name is Sumblin Ali. And what's interesting about this is she did brain scans on young adults, on students, college and graduate students. And she used the same questionnaire that we used in our research. In other words, she used the PARQ, the Parental Alienation Rejection Questionnaire. And she was able to classify a group of students who found both mom and dad accepted them, and that these are now well-adjusted people. And she was able to find another group of students who reported using the PARQ that their parents rejected them. And these people are now maladjusted. So that's really important for us, because she's using the same test and classifying people as accepted or not accepted by the parents. And that has implications for us, because she did brain scans on these people. And that makes us wonder whether brain scans on alienated children might show the same thing. So this is what she did. The subjects, she had these two groups of people, the people who were accepted by the parents and the people who were not accepted by the parents. And in the test, they're in a brain scan apparatus. She manipulates them to think that they have been rejected. In other words, these are people who were already rejected as children. And now she plays this game with them in which they think that they're being rejected by the people playing the game. And she found that in the people who had been rejected as children, certain parts of the brain were activated. And we can read this together, but I don't expect you to remember this. The anterior, posterior cingulate cortex, so on, the dorsolateral and medial prefrontal cortex, and whatever. And in the next slide are actually little diagrams of the brain. and I'm just showing you this to try to make it real, that there are specific parts of the brain that are activated when children and young adults feel that they have been rejected, first by their parents, and now in this game, in this social interaction game, while they're having their brain scan. And then next is a picture of the actual brain scan, which it's just interesting because it just shows how distinct is the activation in these children and these people who, the participants who had a history of being rejected, and now they're being rejected in the brain scan. So it illustrates how these are very distinct regions of activation. So what does this mean? What is the implication for parents and grandparents? I think it means that when your children act in this extremely almost bizarre way of totally accepting one parent and totally rejecting the other one, that something is happening in their brain. They're likely to have some sort of brain, it's not brain damage, but there are pathways in the brain, and that the child is switching from one to the other. And that this, of course, is driven by the alienating behaviors of the preferred parent. And that if in fact this is correct, that severely alienated children have these abnormal pathways in the brain, you have to do something about it. And it's being caused by the acts of the alienating parent. And I think that the solution that we all advise in cases of severe alienation is the child needs to be removed from that household. So I think that helps explain. I think the fact that these changes in the brain helps to explain how determined these children are to have these ideas. So let me go to another topic, which is transitions and what we call rapid transitions. And by this, what I mean in the next slide, that alienated parents have described transitions from very positive to very negative over days or a few weeks. In other words, the parent will be having the child, everything seems fine. And after a few days or a few weeks, everything is totally abnormal. The child is totally negative and totally rejected. Why does this happen? Well, based on what I've said already, that first of all, this transition from totally happy to totally negative is a defense mechanism that the child uses to protect the child from a very uncomfortable loyalty conflict. And not only that, perhaps it's a result of a switch from one pathway in the brain to another. So what does this mean for parents and grandparents? First of all, if this happens, don't try to figure it out. If your child engages in this kind of rapid transition, don't interrogate the child. Don't try to question the child or try to figure it out. I suggest that at least in the beginning, you just go with the flow. You just don't argue about it, kind of accept that state of affairs and do the best you can with a child having that attitude or condition, whatever they're in. And that, because I guess what I'm trying to say is that this appears to be an involuntary thing that's driven by some kind of process in the brain. So this is another idea for parents and grandparents. I think this would be a great research project, just to try to collect cases of this rapid transition. And nobody has done this yet. This is written about. There are anecdotal stories about how this has happened. But I think it would be interesting to collect this systematically. In other words, what you would have to do is create a really good diary, that on a certain date, everything was fine. On another date, we went on a picnic. On another date, we had a birthday party. And then 2 weeks later, on a certain date, things suddenly are negative. And to be able to show that this happens over days or 2 or 3 weeks, which I know many people have experienced, that would be really interesting to write up examples and see if that could turn into a research project. Okay, so here's a new topic: parental alienation and the NMPI. So um, one of the better lines of research is using the MMPI, which of course is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, and using this test. It's a very widely used psychological test, using it in cases of custody evaluations. And so you end up with MMPIs, parents who are alienating parents, parents who are target parents, and also parents who are simply part of a custody evaluation and are needed, and alienation is not occurring. So there was an important study that was actually published way back in 2008 by a man named Robert Gordon. He and his colleagues did the MMPI-2 on more than 100 cases. And this is what they found. The name of their article was MMPI-2 Findings of Primitive Defenses in Alienating Parents. And this was the conclusion that they found. Robert Gordon said, we found that mothers and fathers, both moms and dads, who were alienated had higher or clinical range scores indicating primitive defenses, such as splitting and projective identification, than control mothers and fathers in both our indexes. So he was able to distinguish alienating parents from other parents who were not alienating using the MMPI-2. So I happened to run into Robert Gordon in Lyon, France, of all places, a couple of weeks ago. And he told me that his research has been replicated. And he gave me the reference and I looked it up. And this is by a doctor named Paolo Roma. And the name of this new article that was only published a month or so ago is a comparison of MMPI-2 profiles between parental alienation cases and custody cases. And Dr. Roma said in his results, the results indicated that mothers who were classified as alienated presented a faking good defensive profile, denied hostile and negative impulses, blamed others for their problems, and displayed excessive sensitivity. So this is really important, that using a well-recognized, standardized test that they've been able to show that alienated, and especially severely alienated parents, have a different profile than the target parents or control parents. So why does this matter for parents and grandparents? I think it's really good to know. I think it's reassuring to know that alienating parents have a distinctive personality traits and that these can be measured. I mean, everybody says that, and almost everybody who knows families like this say that, gee, these alienating parents, you know, that sometimes they're described as narcissistic or antisocial or borderline, but that this can be actually measured using this test. By the way, this is a very commonly used test. I'll just make one suggestion, that if you're part of a custody evaluation and they want to give you this test, go, of course, do it, but don't try to outthink the test. Just try to give everyday answers, normal answers, and try to be honest. Don't try to look perfect on this test. Okay, another topic that is sort of like a summary is important research review. So I've given you just a little smattering of some selected research papers and how they might apply to everyday life and how they might help you think about how you relate to your children or grandchildren. Well, a couple of weeks ago, a new paper was published that reviews research over an extended period of time regarding parental alienation. This is by some people whom you probably have heard about: Jennifer Harmon, Richard Warshak, and Demosthenes Larandos. And the name of that paper was Developmental Psychology and the Scientific Status of Parental Alienation. These people collected more than 200 documents, papers that were published in peer-reviewed journals over a period of time, published all over the world in 10 languages. And the results confirm that the current state of parental alienation scholarship meets the criteria for a maturing field of scientific inquiry. And they have criteria for what that means. That first of all, an expanding literature. There are more and more papers being published about parental alienation theory. Secondly, a shift toward quantitative studies. So I mentioned earlier the difference between qualitative studies, which are simply descriptive, and quantitative studies that involve statistics. And so there are more and more of the latter. And their third criteria was a growing body of research that tests theory-generated hypotheses. This is a really important review article. If you happen to be going to court or you're involved with some kind of evaluation, it's really important to be aware that this is the most elaborate and most exhaustive review of the literature on this topic that has ever been published. If you're trying to find it, I think you can just Google the names of the authors: Harman, H-A-R-M-A-N, Warshak, and Lorandos, L-O-R-A-N-D-O-S. I think if you just Google those three words together, this article will pop up. So I've only given you a few examples of research studies today, but this lists and evaluates more than 200 articles. Let me go on to one more topic in which I want to talk about PARP and DSM-5-TR. So what is PARP? PARP is parental alienation relational problem, or parental alienation relational problem, PARP. So that is the diagnostic term that we would like to see added to the DSM-5-TR. The DSM-5-TR, of course, is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the 5th edition, and it's now in what's called the text revisions. So back in the old days, the DSM was only updated about every 10 or every 15 years. And so in between all that time, people had to use the old DSM before the new one was updated. So that changed a few years ago when DSM-5 was published in 2013. They decided that the revisions to the DSM are going to be on an ongoing basis. In other words, they might publish a new one every 5 or 10 years, but there's a committee that reviews changes on an ongoing basis. And as the changes are accepted by the American Psychiatric Association, changes are made to the online, the master copy of the DSM-5, which you can access online if you subscribe to it. Or, schools, graduate schools, medical schools all subscribe to things like this. And so we, my colleagues and I, want to get parental alienation, the actual words in the DSM-5, and we don't have to wait for the new one to be published, that we can go ahead and submit this to the committee that considers these things. So the next slide shows you, just to make you aware, that in 2013, the DSM-5 was published, and only a few months ago, the DSM-5-TR was published, which is called the text revision. That's just to make you aware that there actually has been a new hard copy published a few months ago. But we don't have to wait for years for a new copy to be generated. So even in the DSM-5, as soon as it came out, we were aware, back in 2013, we were aware that the concept of parental alienation was in the DSM, even though the actual words were not. This is really important. That it's my understanding that when they were putting the book together, they wanted to avoid the controversy of actually putting the words parental alienation in the book. But they recognize that the phenomenon happens. And so the concept of parental alienation is expressed in 3 different diagnoses that are in DSM-5. They're all in this chapter called Other Conditions that may be of clinical interest. So I forget the exact name of that chapter. And these are the 3 diagnoses that reflect parental alienation. The first one is child affected by parental relationship distress. That was a brand new diagnosis in DSM-5. And the definition of that includes the following phrase: negative effects of parental relationship discord, for example, high levels of conflict, distress, or disparagement on a child in the family. So that's a paraphrase of what happens in parental alienation, that the conflict, the distress, the disparagement causes distress in the child. That doesn't have the name parental alienation, but it's a paraphrase of the definition. And the second diagnosis in DSM-5 is parent-child relational problem, and part of the definition of that is negative attributions of the other's intentions, hostility toward the other, and unwarranted feelings of estrangement. So that's also a paraphrase of what happens in parental alienation without actually using those words. That the child, or typically the child, applies negative attributions to what the parent is doing, and it's unwarranted. And then the third diagnosis that is in DSM-5, child psychological abuse. And that means harming, one of the examples is harming or abandoning people or things the child cares about. So what this means is that if a person is doing an evaluation and makes a diagnosis of parental alienation, you can use one or several, depending on your outlook, you can use these diagnoses that are in DSM-5 as part of your evaluation if you think that it's present. And you use the diagnosis depending on the focus of your clinical attention. This is true of other conditions in DSM, where the actual term you use depends on what your focus is. For instance, if your focus is on the mental condition of the child, that the child is in a very strong loyalty conflict and it's very distressing to the child, and that's what you have documented in your evaluation, you can use child affected by parental relationship distress. But if your focus is on the relationship between the child and the rejected parent, and that you have documented all the difficulties that are going on between them, and that this all seems to reflect parental alienation, you can use the diagnosis parent-child relational problem. Or if your focus is on the favored parent, the preferred parent, and the alienating behaviors, and that has caused the problem in the child, you can use the diagnosis child psychological abuse. And theoretically, I mean, a person could use all 3 of these if your conclusion is parental alienation. These are diagnoses that you can use. Incidentally, I know that it's really common to say that causing parental alienation constitutes child psychological abuse. I think you have to be a little bit careful when you say that. I don't say that in mild, or usually I wouldn't say that in a moderate case of parental alienation. But I do think that if it's a severe case of parental alienation, you can usually justify saying that the alienating parent has engaged in child psychological abuse. And that's the basis for saying that the child should be removed from that household. Because in other situations involving child abuse, like physical abuse or sexual abuse, the solution, at least for a time, is to remove the child from that household. So I think that that can be applied to parental alienation, especially severe cases of parental alienation. So there's something you can do if you want to help with this process. In other words, we've written up a proposal that we're going to submit to the people who constitute, it's called the DSM-5 Screening Committee. In a couple of months, we're going to send this to the committee. But in the meantime, we are collecting endorsements, and we've notified you all. Most of you are probably subscribers to Family Access, and so Elaine Cobb very nicely sent out a note to all of you about this proposal that we're making regarding PARP, parental alienation relations problem, in the DSM-5. And you can help if you want to endorse the proposal. If you're not clear how to do that, I think in the note that she sent out, it says how you do it. But if it's unclear to you, you can contact me at william.bernet@vumc.org, and I'll take care of it, or I will send you a note back as to how you can endorse it. And we're interested in individuals, for instance, practitioners or researchers or attorneys, but we're also interested in parents. In other words, we consider parents and grandparents to be child advocates in this type of study. And so we welcome endorsements just from parents and grandparents. And so the endorsements are categorized. We have different headings, and so different people, different types of endorsements go in different headings. But we welcome not just practitioners or researchers, but parents, and also organizations. For instance, there's a lot of advocacy organizations who we hope will endorse this, including Family Access has already endorsed this proposal. So we welcome that. So let me wrap up with one more slide, which has to do with the organization that I'm involved in, Parental Alienation Study Group. I'm the president of PASG. And if you're interested in learning more about parental alienation, you're welcome to join this group. There are many, many groups having to do with parental alienation and advocacy and education and so on. They're all excellent. They have somewhat different functions. Family Access is extraordinary in putting on these conferences and the monthly webinar and the weekly television program of Family Divided, and that's their mission. PASG has a slightly different mission, but we do strive to educate not just parents, but attorneys and practitioners and legislators about parental alienation and what to do about it. So I know this is just the beginning of your conference, of the Family Access Conference. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you have a great weekend, and you all take care of yourself.